and start with the land acknowledgement. And so traditionally we've been doing this. We wish to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates for thousands of years. It has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. Our treaty obligations and commitment include learning about the history of these lands and territory and the structured dispossession that Indigenous nations have been subject to by Canada, and learning about justice, equity, structures of power, and to imagine how to build social relations for a different world. We affirm our solidarity with the Indigenous peoples of this land struggling for their self-determination and sovereignty from settler colonialism. Okay, just a few words about Dr. Frederick Kergin, a graduate from medical school at University of Toronto, awarded the Rhodes Scholarship for surgical studies in Oxford. He was chair of the Department of Surgery at the University of Toronto, 1957 to 1966, associate dean of clinical affairs after he served in the role as chair of the department. He integrated all of the residency programs at the fully affiliated hospitals. He was chair of the editorial board of the Canadian Journal of Surgery, president of the American Association of Thoracic Surgery, and I might add right now, as I'm speaking to you, Shaf Kashavji, who's on the line, is the president of this august organization this year, and inventor of numerous procedures such as the Kergin thoracoplasty and bronchoplasty. Here's a list of the previous Kergin Lecture awardees, and you can see a variety of prior department chairs. We have members of parliament, authors, and deans and presidents of the universities and so on. So a real who's who of the world, essentially. And now a little bit about Dr. Corinne Marashko. She did her undergraduate studies at Yale University. Her MD was from Columbia. She began her neurosurgical faculty position at University of Michigan in 1990, and she served as the chief of the pediatric neurosurgery service since then. In 2005, she really demonstrated amazing leadership opportunity and capabilities by becoming the professor and chair, the Julian T. Hoff Chair of the Department of Neurosurgery at the University of Michigan. She's a member of the ACGME Neurosurgery Residency Review Committee, Executive Committee of Women in Neurosurgery Group, Director of the American Board of Neurological Surgery, the first female to serve in that capacity in the United States, and most recently, President of the Society of Neurological Surgeons. Research interests include brain tumors, Chiari malformation, congenital malformation, and co-founder of Project Shunt Guatemala. She has over 150 peer-reviewed scholarly publications to her credit. Here you can see Corinne in the operating room, surrounded by those assisting her and many other observers in the operating room, a leader in Chiari and dysraphism, craniofacial disorders, and brain tumors. Interestingly, over the years, she's been involved in Project Shunt Guatemala, where for numerous years she's gone to Guatemala to help with the instruction of the treatment of hydrocephalus in that country. These are some of the awards that she's received over the years, including the Founders Laurel for the Congress of Neurological Surgeons, the Humanitarian Award of the American Association of Neurological Surgeons, the Nina Starr Bronwell Award, Association of Women Surgeons, the Inspiration Physician Award from the AMA Women Physician Section, and, as mentioned, President of the Society of Neurological Surgeons. And I was in the audience when she gave her amazing presentation just this last fall in Austin, Texas. Here she is being interviewed by Dr. Sanjay Gupta from CNN, and Sanjay is a graduate, I think, of the University of Michigan program, and Corinne maybe can say a few more words about that, but interviewed her and really had remarkable things to say about women in surgery, which you'll hear about, but also her role in neurosurgery at the University of Michigan. When I went on PubMed and checked, we actually, Karen, I don't know if you know this, Corinne, but we actually share a number of publications, more than I had thought. We're collaborators on some of them, but here's a couple that I thought I would put forward. Understanding Sexual Harassment in Neurosurgery and Development of Professionalism and Harassment Policies for Organized Neurosurgery. And Corinne was a real leader in these publications, and wanted to thank her for doing so. I think what Corinne cherishes most in her life is her family, so her husband Scott and their children, Alexandria and Paxton. They enjoy fishing, traveling, and architecture preservation. I just want to conclude with these slides, and this is a photograph of a Neurosurgical Society meeting. It doesn't take much to look at this photograph to recognize the bias and the difference, the way it was actually not that long ago, maybe 3 decades ago. A solitary woman is seen here, and of course that's Kergin with this sea of men essentially around her. And look at where we are today. She's chair of the Department of Neurosurgery at the University of Michigan and has done a fabulous job with her program. It is perhaps the greatest program in neurosurgery in the United States. So, Kergin, congratulations to you. We really look forward to your presentation. And I'm going to stop sharing this screen and I'll bring up your presentation and then you'll be able to present and I'll advance your slides for you. So one moment, we'll be right there.
Thank you very much, Jim.
Okay, we have your slide deck up, Kergin. It's over to you.
Okay, terrific. Well, thank you very much. I am extraordinarily honored to be able to give the Kergin Lecture, and I consider Jim one of my great friends in neurosurgery. In fact, when I was telling someone at the meeting that I was about to give this talk, they said, has there ever been anything that Jim has failed at? And I must say that I looked to him many times for important leadership. And in fact, when we were trying to develop some of the harassment policies for organized neurosurgery, Jim was one of the people I wanted to make certain was on the committee because of his level-headed thinking. So one, thank you very much for letting me present today. As you can see from my title slide, Challenges of Leadership Development, it's been an area that I've been very interested in because I think that as we look to our next generation of leaders, I believe many times we believe they're just born. And I will be honest, I don't think that that's the case. Next slide. My story. I received a bachelor's, as Jim noted, from Yale. I had my time and training at Columbia. I stayed on at Columbia, so I was in New York City for 14 years, and then went to NIH for several years to do a little bit more research than I was doing as a resident. My neurosurgical career, I began at the University of Michigan in 1990 and eventually became chief of pediatric neurosurgery, went on to be chair in 2005. At that time, I was the first woman to hold a chair position in neurosurgery in the country. And to be honest with you, I got tired of being the person who was called upon to regularly rely on, be relied on to deal with problems within a given department. So if you look at my personal neurosurgical career, next slide, you can see that, you know, it was a time in coming to become chair. But once I became chair, for me, it was important that we see other people advance to the level of chair. And I've worked very hard. There are now 5 women in the United States who hold chair positions in neurosurgery. Next slide. On a personal note, and I think this is important because it does sometimes shape you as you come from your origins. I'm an only child. My husband is an architect. I have 2 children, Paxton and Alexandria. And for those of you that didn't quite appreciate it from all the photos that Jim showed, I also have a disability. For most of my life, I have had a full-length leg brace. I have a form of closed spinal dysrhythmism, spina bifida, in which I have a tethered cord. And most recently, about, I'd say 5 years ago, I had surgery. And as a result of that surgery, I then had to start using a wheelchair. So all of my life, I've had at least some external markings of an individual with a disability having a full-length leg brace and built up. By virtue of many things, I am definitely the tortoise. I am not the hare. I am an individual who plans and thinks ahead for most of my aspects because, to be honest, I can't keep running around the way others would. And so I'm very thoughtful about, for example, when I get to do something that I completed in such a way that I don't need to necessarily go back again. Next slide. I'm going to be talking about leadership because I do believe that in this day of COVID, and I think for many of the aspects for us in as leaders, we have to be dealers in hope. We have to be able to put forward the ability to understand that even in the most dire of circumstances, It is a privilege. It is an honor. It is an extraordinary event to be a physician. And we need to pass that on. We need to help individuals see that even in the most difficult of circumstances, it's a joy to be a leader. Next slide. I would also say that if you look at leadership, it's about having a vision, advancing that vision, and next slide, giving the skill set, the support structure. I also think that if you think about it, leadership is very much non-specific to gender. And I say that because I think that although there are different styles of leadership, leadership are certain skill sets that can, in fact, be taught. Next slide. So why consider leadership training in the context of a neurosurgical residency? And I know that there are both orthopedic surgeons, general surgeons, cardiac surgeons in this talk. I very much want to say that it's why leadership in any context, particularly in an academic practice. I would point out to the fact that all surgeons are leaders by virtue of their jobs. They have leadership opportunities in the office, certainly in the operating room, in the laboratory, in the classroom. And whether we like it or not, our community sees us as leaders by virtue of what we do and by virtue of the things that we hopefully are passing on to our next generation. Next slide. So what are the challenges in this new age for all of us in medicine? Well, there are obviously work hour restrictions. Those are not going to go away. The good old days of living and breathing in the operating room are not going to be there. And frankly, the next generation doesn't want that. They recognize that a balance between one's personal life and one's academic life is important. The assumptions of the past are no longer true. That is that if you spend enough time at the knee of the great professor, you will in fact pick up what you need to be an adequate surgeon. Osmosis isn't the process any longer. There are also significant generational differences. And I think that it's really important that you understand those generational differences so that you can help your young faculty, your young residents accomplish the goals that you have for them and the goals that they have for themselves. And you need to define those goals and missions within a residency program. Next slide. So what's about residency training? Residency training is a very hierarchical structure. There are graduated levels of responsibility. There is a compression of the learning curve. And it's very important to realize that by virtue of spending less time with a given resident, you need to make sure that that time is well spent and thoughtful. Face-to-face time is obviously decreased, and it's important that you find a process by which you can accelerate the transfer of learning. Next slide. So why care about leadership development? I mean, we get so many other things that we teach people. Why do we need to think about this? And I think it's important because I think it helps develop a framework that accelerates the learning process. It establishes a way to define a job so that one understands one's responsibilities and, most importantly, what's to be accomplished with that job. There's also a recognition that at the end of it all, we are training future leaders, future surgeons. And to be able to make certain that they are capable is one of our most sacred responsibilities. It's also important that we provide a skill set that they can make use of when they have difficult times or when they're under difficult circumstances. So what about leadership training? These are skills that are required to conquer adversity and emerge stronger and more committed. And I do believe that many of those skill sets are applicable throughout one's life. So the same ones that make you a good leader make you capable of getting through COVID, getting through all the various strains and stresses that we're dealing with today. There's also a hardiness and the ability to grasp the context if one is to survive. I think those skill sets of understanding how to communicate and how to be able to get through that difficult time are part of leadership training. Next slide. So if we look here at Michigan, it says at the top of the slide, we developed a curriculum for leadership development. And what we did was we assigned a senior neurosurgeon as a coordinator of the course, and that course started about 15 years ago and has continued. We borrowed heavily from known leadership development courses and curriculum, and we made use of things from the military, from the AANS, the American College of Surgeons, AAMC, ELAM, a variety of places. And one reading list that we started with was One Bullet Away, The Making of a Marine Corps Officer. And I recommend it to you because I think it's a useful example of how the military itself does it. Next slide. We look at the Marine Corps leadership traits. I think they're very interesting, and I actually think they have applicability to all of us in medicine. So first, let's look at bearing. Creating a favorable impression. Courage. Recognizing fears or criticism, but continuing on. And what do they say? Courage is really only demonstrated when one is afraid. Decisiveness. Making decisions promptly, announcing them clearly. When we talk about safety, we have to announce those decisions clearly and expect the necessary reaction from our colleagues. Dependability. The certainty of the proper performance of duty, that one is going to be able to make certain that things are going to be done and that you can be relied upon when given a task to accomplish them. Endurance. All of us have been stressed and strained, I think, in the last several years, but the ability for both the mental and physical aspects to have the stamina to withstand those stresses and fatigue is important. Enthusiasm, the display of sincere interest and exuberance in the performance of a job and duty. And I will say I'm guilty of that in spades. I still love what I do, and I'm ever grateful every day that I have a position and a job, frankly, where I really feel that I can influence things. Next slide. So what are some of the other leadership traits? Well, initiative, taking action in the absence of orders, seeing a problem, fixing a problem, and being happy to be able to do that. Integrity, an uprightness of character and soundness of principles, such that one is always truthful and honest and approaches things with a certain humility. Judgment, the ability to weigh facts and possible courses of action in order to make sound decisions. And then justice, giving reward and criticism according to the merits of the situation. Next slide. Knowledge. Ultimately, one of the most important things we do is convey knowledge. One must understand the science and the art of one's profession. And then again, one must also know one's team. Loyalty, faithfulness to one unit, peers, and patients, recognizing that loyalty must be within the context of the job to be performed. Tact, the ability to deal with others without creating hostility. And then unselfishness, avoidance of providing for one's own comfort and personal advancement at the expense of others. And I think that's an important one to keep in mind. I'm always most impressed, as we are in this resident interview season now, with those individuals that make the entire team shine, not just themselves. So we wanted to create within our institution and within our department a culture of mentoring. And so next slide, we actually went through the effort of trying to figure out what were the principles that were necessary to do that. So we discussed mentoring at a variety of levels within the department. We wanted to reward and acknowledge when there was successful mentoring. We wanted to provide feedback and education as to what were best practices. And the most important thing we realized was that there needs to be a commitment on both sides of the street, on the mentee and the mentor. And so we looked at that as something we actually wanted to assess. And like so many things, once you start to assess it, people begin to pay attention to it. Next slide. So when you think about mentoring in the larger sense, as a neurosurgeon, you're going to be a leader in the operating room, but you can also be a mentor to all members of your team, and you can promote all parts of the team. You can encourage and recognize the strength of a team, and that team approach really can get you through the most difficult of circumstances in the OR. Whether you want to or not, you need to recognize your stature within the community and realize that even with simple things that you do as part of your community role, you create a mentoring relationship for others. I'm always shocked by the fact that there are people watching me that I don't even recognize. I've given talks to brownie groups and then had people come up to me years later to say, I decided to become a doctor after brought those plastic models of the brain, and I was thinking to myself, wow, this is really fascinating. This is really interesting. So you never know the little acts of excursion into the community and what they can lead to eventually. Next slide. So if you wanted to create a culture, we had to decide what the culture was that we wanted. And so we actually did a retreat early in my time as chair in which we wanted to figure out what was the special spice, if you will, that made the Department of Neurosurgery that had been created so many years ago special at Michigan. So we wanted a supportive culture that tackled complex problems, and where our principles aligned with our teams. Did we have good communication, accountability? Were we execution driven? And most importantly for me, were we creating an environment where individuals could be successful in mentoring and necessarily receive coaching when they weren't or when they needed help? Next slide. So one of the most important principles, and I think this is absolutely true always, it begins and ends with people. So you want to get the right people, choose the right people from the very beginning. We put a lot of energy and effort as we're looking at our residents, and I think that's important. I view those days of resident interviews as among the most important in the academic year because they do dictate what the future is going to be for our department. Next slide. Again, leadership, again, one man in 1,000 is a leader of men. The other 999 will follow women. Next slide. So when we want to look at women in leadership roles, and I was asked to speak specifically about this, there are barriers to women in achieving leadership roles. You need to get in the door. Now, at this point in time, at least in the United States, between 52 and 54% of a medical school class are women. But when I started in my residency, I was the first woman to be accepted to a neurosurgical position at the Neurologic Institute in New York at Columbia. Those days are gone, and I appreciated the pictures that Jim showed because it really was pretty funny. You know, most places, for those of us that are women, there are often longer lines, for example, in restrooms and things like that. Going to a neurosurgical meeting, I can honestly tell you that that was not the case. Most of the meetings I've been to, I'm very used to hearing gentlemen, 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 oh, and Corinne. And, you know, when they're getting to move or do something. I think it's important to realize that if you're going to choose a specialty, particularly for medical students, the amount of contact time is important. When I look at some of my friends at Columbia, I'm always a little bit jealous of them because they have a standard week in which all the medical students rotate through neurosurgery. And I think it's, you know, been evidence that many, many, many spectacular neurosurgeons came out of Columbia by virtue of the fact that they have that week and medical students get inspired. So I think it's important for all of us, if we really do believe in our subspecialties, to get out there and spend some time with the students. The students will immediately respond to the mentors that they see, and then in fact they choose their eventual specialty often by virtue of who they spend time with. So for me, it was understanding what it took to become a neurosurgeon, and eventually why I wanted to be a neurosurgeon was because I found the nervous system exciting, fascinating, important to my own way of thinking. Next slide. So if we look at the representation of women in the medical profession, what we can see is that, you know, students in the medical school have steadily increased, whereas the number of women as physicians is slightly lower. And so that gap that exists between the number of students and the number that are professing indicates that there has been some attrition. And those are things we need to look at and understand. Next slide. You know, finishing a residency, finishing a neurosurgical residency particularly, is a daunting task. I've learned over the years that, in fact, trying to understand women and coaching them becomes something that you need to be able to focus on. So if I look at the barriers now, what I recognized is that some of them were the fact that I wasn't effective enough in understanding what some of their individual needs were. And I think we've gotten better with that. There's a great series of papers that were written by the head of the University of North Carolina women's soccer coach, who, in looking at the parallels and analysis of how he trained women versus how he trained men, and he was famous for doing both quite well, he really recognized there was a difference. And I will comment on this because I have seen it to be true in more ways than one, and that is there's an internalization often of criticism and advice by women, which is not helpful in the sense that one can make a comment about, let's say, a given wound that was closed, and which you said, listen, that wasn't a very good job, you need to do a little bit better. And what is heard is, you don't think I'm good at what I'm doing, I shouldn't do this, as opposed to just a simple statement as to that individual event. And so understanding that sometimes that mentoring is a little bit different is important. And he made some really excellent points about it. And I recommend that all of you look at some of his articles, particularly in Sports Illustrated, in which he talked about that coaching difference, particularly for soccer players, and how he was able to get, a team to the Olympics, etc. So what about the product of a residency? We all know the product of a residency is a well-trained physician, a well-trained surgeon. It's also important that you help individuals find jobs. I think it's really, really important when you're looking at your own area to be able to help and elevate the people that you're training. And sometimes that does require a little bit more push for some than others. And that's what you need to do when you're looking at the hiring practices within your own department, but also within the residents that you accept. Next slide. So what are some of the other barriers to the advancement of women in academics? Well, you have to understand, this is for both men and women, what the goals of the department and the institution are. I think there's nothing worse than being in a situation where you and your personal goals are not aligned with the institutions. I've been fortunate for most of my life. The alignment of my own desires and what I wanted to achieve were very much in line with the department I worked in and the institution I was part of. I do believe that it's also important that for every individual within particularly an academic surgical type department, that you develop an area of expertise, that you're really the go-to person for that. I think Jim Rucka has told us again and again, publishing is not something to be frightened of. It's something that should be done. It's important that you develop skill sets in communicating, not just within the operating room, but beyond that. And then I do believe that leadership skills help in the development of those finer points. Next slide. So what about women in leadership? Well, there's a low proportion of senior academic women that are in leadership positions. Although in 2015, 39% of all faculty were women, only 22% were full professors, 16% were department chairs, and 16% were medical school deans. That's a pretty small number when you think about the fact that 54% of the matriculating medical students are women. And the barriers are not insignificant. The barriers to the time frame in which one is accelerating one's career, the barriers to the enormous personal responsibilities that many women do maintain are also things to be considered. Next slide. So if you look here, there's also a gender gap on many levels. This is a slide which is from the New England Journal, in which it looks at the representation of women on editorial boards and the gender gap with respect to authorship in academic medical literature. And what you see is that, again, we're getting better, but we still have not moved much more above the 10 to 15%, even for things like publications, editorial board representation, et cetera. And I bring this up because I think it's something which we as educators need to think about. We need to encourage our faculty, both male and female, to take on some of these additional responsibilities. And I think we have to find support structures to help all of our faculty achieve their highest potential. Next slide. If you look at the even the attainment of independent funding, the 5-year rate of R1 attainment, it's about 19% among women and about 25% among men. So if we look at it, there's still that difference, and that difference will only accelerate as you go further along in time. Next slide. So what about a career in surgery? You know, I think a career in surgery starts out with some of the principles of being capable, but it also means that you need to develop a reputation. And so it's not just about the technical skills and the ability to be able to perform the job, it's also about the ability to communicate that. And you need to be able to do that across with a variety of individuals. One of the most important things I've learned over time is that you need to recognize the audience to which you're speaking to, because everything, including what I'm saying to you today, is being interpreted between your ears in a way which is unique to you. And understanding who you are and what your goals and what your needs are is important. And particularly for the surgical group, that means building a practice. And building that practice allows one the ability to be viewed with a solid reputation and to demonstrate the skill sets that hopefully you've received during a residency training. Next slide. One of the things I think I've learned over time is that I tried to make use of the isolation of being a woman and having a disability as a way of allowing me to go, if I will, on my path less traveled, not to be afraid of that isolated path. But there is clear isolation, and it matters. There have been analyses done again and again in which it says that if you are under 15% in any given group, you can't even call yourself a minority. What you are just isolated individuals. And so it's important to be able to feel part of a team. My senior colleague when I first joined Michigan was Joan Venice. She retired within literally months of the time that I arrived, but I did get that opportunity to spend some time with her. She's one of the founders of pediatric neurosurgery in the United States. Joan said that that was one of the hardest parts for her, was recognizing that one felt isolated, did not feel like part of a team by virtue of gender, and then even sometimes by virtue of subspecialty like pediatric neurosurgery. But it's important for us as leaders and as trainers of the next generation to celebrate the diversity of the team and the need for the different roles. You know, we all can't be the quarterback, but we do have to recognize that all those roles are important. I have to be honest, one of the simple things I do is ask my residents regularly, who's the person that picks up the trash in their office or their place? And if they can't, I kind of point out, you realize that that person didn't exist, what your office or what your space would look like. Because I do think that if you recognize all parts of the team, you can begin to understand a little bit more about yourself and where you fit into that team. Next slide. If I look at the American Board of Neurologic Surgery data, which is the thing I'm most familiar with, the first woman to be board certified was in 1960. And then there were another 5 women in the 70s. It was 22 women. In the 80s and early 90s, it was 67 women. And then we didn't do so well. We kind of flattened out a bit when you went to the 90s and 2000s. Well, we're getting better. Right now, about 6 to 8% of the U.S. Board-certified neurosurgeons are women, though about 20% of the trainees in neurosurgery are women. And at present, literally 25 to 30% of the applicants that are coming through are women. So the total number of neurosurgeons in the United States, somewhere around 6,500, so small group. We're definitely not, there's not a lot of us. Next slide. We look at women in neurosurgery. 52 to 55% of medical students are female. So our numbers, particularly in neurosurgery, need to increase. 20% of neurosurgery residents are female, and that's been stable really since the late 90s. The applicant rate this year was almost 30%. So the number of female applicants actually went up this year. 10% of academic neurosurgeons are presently women, and there are now 4 chairs besides myself that are out there. Again, a small number of women are also in private practice in neurosurgery. Next slide. So we look at those numbers, and you can see over time they're getting better, but it's still, we're not talking huge numbers at this stage. But in neurosurgery, we're trying to make efforts to at least make it a more warm, open, and accepting area. Next slide. We look at board certifications. Those numbers have not really risen as much as you'd like to see, but they are definitely slowly getting better over time, that little pink box that you see down here. Next slide. So what about our assessments? As we look at our young faculty and we look at how we're developing our curricula, I think we need to understand what it is that they'd like to achieve, but also understand where we can help the young faculty to make them better, to help our young residents to make them better. So you need to understand their weaknesses and their strengths, and you need to compare and contrast their careers and those that they wish to emulate. I always ask people where they want to be in 1 year, 2 years, 5 years, just to get a sense of what their own belief in themselves is, what they think they want to achieve. And then I think one of our jobs as educators is to be able to demonstrate for them other paths that might be available, but also ways in which they can achieve their own goals. I do believe that sometimes there are skill sets that are not necessarily apparent, but become really vital as one is beginning to think of a career, and most importantly, to be able to be successful in that career. Next slide. And these are going to just be some practical ideas that we've thought about at Michigan for a while now about for our young faculty. So what about national organizations? I believe that good leaders put forth their faculty and residents for different positions. You get people into important roles like being reviewers of journals, like being on the scientific program committee, being something like a website presence. All those things are important. And so I try very hard to think about my faculty and think of those that I'm responsible for scientific programs, for meeting planning, for executive committees, because I think that, again, COVID has certainly taught us many things, but one of the things that did hurt us is that camaraderie that occurs as part of a national meeting, et cetera. Next slide. There are also educational opportunities, and I think it's important to think about them, to have a sort of list of them, particularly when you're dealing with residents, but even with young faculty. So there are institutional career development seminars that are available usually, and those should be made use of regularly. There's things from the AAMC, Executive Leadership in Academic Medicine, the business school, usually in any given university has outreach programs, and then obviously national organizations. Next slide. Women in neurosurgery for me, and this is again very specific to the area of neurosurgery, has been a part of a vital organization. It was started in the late 60s, and we really began by looking at a white paper on women in neurosurgery. The organization has adapted and grown very effectively. It now acts as a source of advice for national organizations, and it's now got its own section even within neurosurgery, which was something that I wouldn't have thought possible, but occurred a few years back. It's also been a source for mentoring of young women, and for me personally, it created my Goggin, my Good Old Girls Network, and it provided me with the ability to have some individuals of a like mind who could also be both mentors, friends, and critics, who could provide some honest assessments of some of the goals that I may have set for myself, but also to provide that criticism that's so important to say, whoa, stop, that's going in the wrong direction, while at the same time still being supportive. Next slide. Career development is not a small task, but it's one that I think leaders need to take on robustly. In the end, it's important for any young faculty to find a mentor And it's easier to do that when you're working with quality people. Growing one's experience is not, insignificant. And as I said, finding an area for which your reputation can be viewed as stellar is important. I personally get a great deal of sense of belonging and feeling of pride when I do some volunteer work, and that's why we started this Project Shunt, our outreach to Guatemala. And I can't believe how much it transformed not just our residency, but even our faculty, because the people that were involved in it really felt a sense of pride in the fact that they were giving back to the world in a way which was meaningful to them. I definitely do believe, as I said before, that you need to be an expert in something. And then personally, for me, it's always a challenge. It's kind of like walking uphill sometimes. Publishing a paper is always complicated. And I always find those last 10% of what needs to be done takes me the longest. And I worked very hard to make that last 10% within my own department easier by making sure that we had editors and others that could help us get through those last phases and stages of when you've got the great idea and you've written most of it, but you just need to buff it now to have it ready. Because publishing is important, and it is one of the ways in which, particularly in academics, you are identified. Next slide. What are the responsibilities of a leader? Well, leadership roles often mean less control of your life and less time for your own career development. Anybody who knows me well knows that I use this phrase, and I don't mean it to be trite, but it's true. When you decide to take on a real leadership role, you have to change your perspective. I believe very much in the servant leadership model. And most of the time in a young person's career, they want to be the sun. They want everyone to know what they're doing. They're very happy about things. They want to show off and show their talents and skill sets. But if you're going to take on the role of leader, I think you've got to learn how to be the moon. And that is that everything about you is reflected glory. And so what should happen is that many of the individuals that are part of your sphere are recognized in many, the first sentence, far greater than you are. And I say that because I do believe that great leaders inspire not only great leadership in others, but also great success in others. So I realize that I've got a larger constituency than just my department now. And by virtue of that, I need to act as an institutional as well as a departmental leader. And those roles are not insignificant. Next slide. So again, in my own case, getting back to that, I've been very fortunate. I've got good, strong family support. I do have other obligations by virtue of being a mom, by virtue of a person with a disability that has to deal with that disability as part of my own life. And I know that my own personal attributes are that I don't like confrontation, but that I've learned that there are times when I must confront people and I must do it aggressively because it's important for the team that I lead. I've always been asked, when is the right time to assume a leadership role? I don't think there's ever a right time. There's only the time that it presents itself. And you always have to ask the question, are they going to come around again? I remember Ed Oldfield, who was the chief of neurosurgery for many years at NIH, at one point when I was talking to him about whether I should leave NIH or what I should do, and he said to me, there are opportunities that only come at certain points. If you're going to do that, you need to recognize that the decision you make to not take something may not ever come around again. And so you have to judge that in the process of when you're thinking about your career. I know for me that one of the things that I was most afraid of in becoming the chair was, one, that I was going to be the first woman to be a chair, but two, the person who I admired most and who was one of the greats of neurosurgery was the chair of neurosurgery at Michigan, and I was going to be talking about, whether or not I could fill his shoes. But you know what? I just created different shoes. Next slide. I think a little bit more about when I've assumed a role of leadership, what it means, and I think you need to discuss that openly with people so they understand that there are sacrifices that one makes in the role of leadership and that it may not always be for everyone. and that the decision as to what really floats your boat is important. Organization is not something that I think many of us do easily, but sometimes you need to literally think about that in the process of whether you're willing to take on a role, because doing a role badly serves no one, including yourself. I learned important things about leadership. I learned about, the meetings. I learned about, that I would need to get better mentoring. In my case, it meant having an executive coach. And I knew this was going to be a stigma, whether I wanted it or not, and being the first chair of a neurosurgery department. And that stigma really influenced me a bit, in that I was surprised at the number of times I would get asked to sort of offer an opinion on individuals that were struggling in a given department who happened to be women around the country. And I really realized that I don't have an ownership of knowledge of how to fix those circumstances. Next slide. You need to have work-life balance. All of us need to do that. You need to have, as I like to call it, the deliberate pursuit of happiness, which means that you do set aside time that you put forward for your family and for those that you care about, because the times are never perfect for anyone. But again, it's easy to short sheet the most important people in your life. Next slide. There are things that I did right in my own development of leadership, and I think these are things that are important and need to be thought of for individuals as they're trying to aspire for leadership. Working on the promotions committee for both the medical school as well as the department, working on the medical school executive committee were all valuable. Taking certain leadership classes, including the ELAM and AAMC and even American College of Surgeons, was important. And then for me personally, when I realized that I was going to become the chair, making sure that I interviewed and talked with all of our faculty members to make sure that my goals aligned with some of their dreams. And then again, as I mentioned, having an executive coach was certainly valuable. Next slide. Good leaders. It's the same for whether you're a neurosurgeon or orthopedic surgeon, general surgeon, anybody. You promote programs, you develop groups, you have an institutional perspective, you communicate, and I've learned, even when I think I've communicated enough, it's still not enough. And then you inspire, you get buy-in from others to achieve goals. Next slide. I always say, remember why you became a surgeon. For me, it's always been about the passion and the art of science, of surgery. I wanted to emulate those that I admired, and I saw some great leaders and great people in neurosurgery that I wanted to be like. And I also recognized that I was going to have to do it in a road that was different than others. I wanted to pass on my gifts actively to others, but I also wanted to make sure that the people that I was mentoring understood what their own lives were going to be, and that it couldn't necessarily be mine. And it's a real privilege to be a doctor. I'm going to say that again and again. The number of lives that we touch in a given day should keep us humble. And you have to think of yourself as being someone who, by virtue of that privilege, really does lead and mentor, because sometimes you can be amazed by the people that you have helped in ways that you don't even recognize. Next slide. Unconscious biases are there, and one of the things we did was to create unconscious bias training, and there's really a huge body of literature which suggests that that's ingrained in us in so many ways. And the more we can point that out and develop ways around it, it's going to be important. I was very honored to hear you talk about your recognition of First Peoples, just even from the land that you own in your institution. We need to recognize our biases, recognize from the history that they came from, and deal with them. Next slide. I think we do know that there are, it's important to have a level playing field. We need to have an area in which we can have practices that are gender neutral. And I think we're going through a lot of changes now which are helping with that. Leave policies are better. I have both men and women taking maternal, paternal leaves. Expectations for work hours have changed, and that's important. And tenure clocks have changed. Even with COVID, we changed our tenure clock. You need to recognize that there's biological clock and the professional clock for women, and you need to make certain that that's recognized and understood, and to deal with it so that there are not these inequities that proceed along and keep getting worse. Next slide. Institutional changes are important. You can do interventions at any stages along the way. One of the most important ones is to be recognized. And so the vulnerability that one sees in the attrition of a young woman, particularly in some of the surgical specialties, can be addressed because of good mentoring and good development of leadership skills within those individuals to be able to express themselves and be able to find ways to deal with the stresses that they feel in their lives. Biases, one needs to eclipse that at the origin. It needs to be recognized that those biases, when dealt with, really do create cultural transformation. And obviously, a transparent and consistent criteria for advancement and compensation. All of us deal with this, and I think it needs to be addressed and recognized and stated clearly that that's something that's thought about. Next slide. So in conclusion, I think we women have made substantial strides. I think gender equity is important, but it's not just a slow pipeline. We need to be able to take those that are already coming through us and reward them similarly and help develop them. You have to sometimes develop targeted interventions. I really do care a great deal about making certain that there's a balance within my residency and within my faculty of a wide variety of people that really reflect what our world looks like today. And so my last slide here on leadership, my last slide I think is true. If your actions inspire others to dream more, learn more, do more, and become more, then you're a leader. And so I sort of wanted to bring it all together by simply saying, one, thank you. Jim is a good friend, and all of the folks in pediatric neurosurgery at Toronto have been good friends to me. And I hope that all of you think of yourself as leaders, because in the process of taking care of your patients, your teams, and each other, you are. And that needs to be recognized, celebrated, and you need to think of the ways in which you can make that leadership better. So thank you very much.
Great. Thanks, Corinne. Marvelous, wonderful lecture for all of us on leadership. And I must tell you in advance, some of the slides that I showed at the beginning for your introduction were in collaboration with Nate Selden. Nate is now chair of the program of neurosurgery in Oregon, in Portland, Oregon. And he is a colleague of Corinne, and he introduced Corinne at the Society of Neurological Surgeons meeting where Corinne was just recently the president. So I borrowed those slides, Corinne. I hope you don't mind. But it was really interesting that one slide of you in that sea of men, and then fast forward to the present with you and your department. I think that's a truly telling story. But I mean, are you optimistic that at least for neurosurgery, it's heading in the right direction?
I think we have a conscious effort on all of our parts to provide an environment which allows individuals of race, all religions, all genders to succeed. I think we're trying. You know, it's hard, but I have to tell you, I'm in a meeting now, pediatric neurosurgery, and I thought, wow, what a difference. My husband said it, because these guys were all wearing three-piece suits out in the middle of, warm climates. We're all sitting around in shorts and T-shirts now, and people are speaking honestly. They're doing collaborative work. I looked at all this and I thought, again, evolution, it occurs slowly. It chips away slowly. But if you think about it and you bring it to the forefront, I do think those changes can occur. I am actually optimistic. The one thing we cannot escape is the biologic clock. And as a result of that, we need to make certain that we create processes which allow that biologic clock to be integrated into the overall advancement within academic medicine.
Great. Thanks, Corinne. Any questions from our panelists on the line? Carol has a question for you, Corinne.
Hi, Corinne. I really appreciated your focus on leadership development throughout training and as a young faculty. And I think we're trying our best with this, but it's still, we will have faculty positions, leadership positions where we have a search and only a certain phenotype applies. So how do you interpret it when, say, you get 12 male applicants for a position and no female applicants? What does that mean to you, and how can we address it?
Well, I think part of our obligations is to have individuals actually reach out into the community. And so I have to tell you, I actually know that I'm going to get every single week, every single month, somebody calling me and asking me, do you know anybody who's a good, maybe female applicant for this role? And I used to hate it, but I realize now it's an opportunity to help others. And so I must tell you that one of the things you need to be is very conscious of the fact that you need to really reach into the various lists and say, are there other people that you think out there might be good? And specifically, go for some of those individuals. Encourage them to do it. Many times people just say, oh, I'm never going to get it, so why should I bother? I do think the other thing you have to do is when you see a situation developing where all the upper echelon don't display the diversity you think is important, to call them on it and to say, have you thought about the fact that you look at this picture? Does this make sense to you? And I find that has worked. I also think that getting people into the right places so they can advance to the upper levels is important. And so making sure that they start out on the committee but eventually advance up to be the chair of the committee so that they can eventually become an officer of the group and then eventually become the president of the group is important. And so getting people in at the front door and saying to them, this is the process by which you get to that next level.
Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Carol. Michael Failings has a question. Michael?
Just a comment. So, Karen, thank you so much for your inspiring words. And I think you're really kind of an embodiment of somebody who's truly kind of led by example. And I think that's kind of one of the most powerful forms of leadership. So thank you so much for your words and also for your inspiration to many of us.
Thanks, Michael. Thank so we have one last question, Corinne. It's from Hugh Scully. He's a cardiac surgeon at the University of Toronto, and he recognizes that neurosurgery doesn't have the greatest parity for gender balance, which you mentioned in your presentation. But he also said that other divisions in surgery, such as cardiac, urology, orthopedics, are also behind. Do you have any insights on those other areas and divisions and what's being done across the country in the United States for trying to get better gender representation?
I know, for example, the orthopedics best of all, and orthopedics is actually in some ways worse than neurosurgery in terms of its representation. And so they've now started some support groups similar to the Women in Neurosurgery group. They've also developed some leadership development programs, and they're working very hard to be able to create some pipelines for leadership roles. I think that again, it starts with the simple things. It starts with getting into the committee and recognizing it. So for me as a chair, but I think in other places as well, nominating people so that they can get in that first door. And that often means just consciously, literally looking at the whole list. Because what often happens is that you think of those that are most like you. And it's important that you sort of break out of that mold and look at the whole spectrum of available candidates. So that's one thing. But the second thing is in cardiac's making real effort now to also, one of the things I was told, I will say this from colleagues, and I'm going to be unabashedly honest here. One of my colleagues in neurosurgery said, we really don't want to have too many women go into neurosurgery because any specialties that a lot of women go into, the salaries go down and the elitism of it seems less. That's something we got to get rid of. That's an attitude which is inappropriate. And I honestly think that the elitism and the salaries come from the work that's generated and the difficulty of it and the extent of training, not from the gender of the people that are applying it. So I would definitely say that I think it's important that it be recognized that the talents of the individual often are not in any way gender related and need to be ones that are, have you given people an opportunity? Have you recognized that the fact that they perhaps don't speak with the same authoritative, strong voice as others, that it's merely a representation of the style with which they present, not the content of what they're presenting? And those are just important ways of recognizing it. Again, I've often found that there's a reluctance on the part of some of the women that I'm training to say that I know how to do this operation until they really do know all aspects of it. And they're less likely to be as aggressively wanting to do things. And you need to encourage them. You need to help them understand how they can really own something and know and own it well. So I'm very impressed with the fact that orthopedics recognizes this problem and it's trying to address it directly. Cardiac a little bit less so, but I know other areas as well, vascular. Recognizing the talents and creating that support structure for women to advance to various levels within that area.
Okay, thanks, Corinne. And one last late-breaking question here from Karen Devon. The question reads, thank you for the inspiration. You spoke about choosing how to spend time and the pursuit of happiness. There's often a disconnect between the demands of the healthcare system we work in and those lofty goals in academics. I assume this applies in the US as it does in Canada. How do you suggest we navigate this?
Oh, that's a tough one. I think one of them is to respect boundaries, and that is to recognize that there are certain times when someone is either away or participating in an important family activity, and those are sacrosanct. Some of the best ways to accomplish that is by having a sufficient redundancy or a sufficient partnership that one can, with faith and calmness, say, this person is taking on this time and I am away, and not feel guilty or feel displaced. But there needs to be a balance in that, such that the individuals with whom you are sharing those responsibilities do really feel that they are being treated fairly. And so I will tell you that in my own case, I have unbelievably great partners that I work with, and we trust each other to say, yeah, you're in charge. You're taking on things at this point.
Okay, so Corinne, thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, you need to recognize again that Corinne was giving this lecture from outside of the continental United States in Hawaii, where there's a 5-hour time difference. It's 3 a.m. for her. So, Corinne, we really appreciate your doing this, going well above and beyond the call of duty.
I'm sorry that the bandwidth was just insufficient, that I had to do this the way we did. I hope the slides were in sync.
No, it worked out really well, and thank you so much. You're an inspiration, and your lecture was inspirational to all of us. Congratulations on your tenure as chair of the Department of Neurosurgery at the University of Michigan. We wish you well on all of your future many endeavors that you're taking part in. We do have some parting gifts for you that will be sent to you back in Michigan when you get back home. And once again, thank you for the outstanding 2022 Kergin Lecture. Thanks very much, Corinne. And thanks everybody for joining today. Enjoy Hawaii, Corinne. Okay. Take good care. See ya.
Bye-bye. I miss you, Jim. Bye-bye.